This is my homebrew demo of Final Fantasy X running on the original PlayStation, not a PC remake or a retro shader, which is a problem because Final Fantasy X was built for the PS2, and it was one of the biggest leaps forward the series had ever made. So I wanted to answer a weird question. What if instead of Final Fantasy VII, 8, or 9, this was the story Square had tried to make on the PS1? Well, we wouldn't know until we tried, so let's get into it. The slice I picked was Seymour's fight at Macalania Temple, because that scene is basically a stress test for every major mechanic of the game. The first version of the map wasn't that great, it was mostly me trying to get the proportions of the room to make sense before worrying about whether it looked good. So I blocked out the floor and walls first, and that's always the awkward stage because it looks so plain. Once the floor textures went in, the project finally started to look a little bit like a game. The wall textures pushed it further, and then the separate door model and dome gave the back of the room something to focus on. That was the point where I realized the camera was going to matter as much as the geometry. I spent a while in free cam just trying to find a shot that felt believable. That sounds like a small step, but old Final Fantasy games were highly dependent on camera placement. Final Fantasy VII through Final Fantasy IX are full of angles that quietly tell you what the scene is about. Resident Evil does the same thing in a horror context. And once the camera was fixed, I could do something really cool. But before that, I needed people in the room. Titus was the first character I brought in, and the scene immediately felt better. A room can look fine in a still image, but it doesn't become a game until someone can move through it. Then I added the other party members. They weren't doing anything yet, but even static party placement matters in a Final Fantasy scene. But once I added Seymour, the scene began to break. Seymour was different because he was a live textured model. The scene started lagging badly, and that forced the first major decision. Instead of rendering the temple every frame, I captured the finished camera view without the characters and turned it into the background. In the build, that background becomes PS1 TIM textures drawn back as flat strips across the screen. The console's not really drawing the temple anymore, it's drawing an image of the temple, then placing the live characters and UI over it. And that's exactly the kind of trick that made PS1 Final Fantasy work. When you look at places like Midgar or Balam Garden, most of what you're admiring is not real-time 3D. It's pre-rendered art with real-time characters walking through it. Once the room was working, I started building the cutscene logic. The trigger is simple in a very old RPG way. Titus can run around until he reaches the center of the room, the code checks his distance from that point, and once he's close enough, control gives way to the cutscene. At first, the dialogue box appeared instantly. It worked, but it felt like debug text, so I used Final Fantasy VIII as the reference point. I made the text box open over a few frames. It's not a huge feature, but it made the cutscene feel much more intentional. And I reversed the animation when the new line was coming in. Then I started scripting the actual confrontation. Yuna enters partway through, runs toward the party, and turns towards Seymour. But before we could do the fight, I wanted to add an FMV, or full motion video. Some of those old Square FMVs from the PS1 era are so memorable, and they must have seemed incredible graphically compared to the actual game graphics from that time. I made a short 90s CG style shot of Seymour in Blender, then rendered it into a normal video. For the PlayStation, this gets converted into an STR file. That's the disk streaming video format the console can feed into its MDEC hardware, which is basically the PS1's dedicated FMV machine. The video is not just loaded into RAM and played from memory, it streams in sectors from the disk while the scene is running. The STR file itself is around 1.3 megabytes. For this clip, it contains 58 video frames, and most frames are split across 8 or 9 disk sectors. Each decoded frame is then copied into VRAM in 16 pixel wide vertical slices, and here's how it turned out. For the battle, I used the same fixed camera logic as the temple. The battle background is also a still image. If the arena doesn't need to move, the console should spend its effort on the things that do. I brought in Yuna and Lulu first, then I tried to bring in Seymour again, and this time he broke in a much more visually upsetting way. He had texture problems. PS1 texture issues are strange if you're used to modern engines. Today, you tend to think of a texture as a file attached to a material. On the PS1, VRAM is a physical space that has to be packed carefully. Frame buffers live there and texture pages live there. If two things overlap, the console just draws whatever memory it finds and acts like that was your plan. That means if you don't pack and budget for every little thing extremely intentionally, you're going to run into a lot of issues down the line, or in this case, immediately. But once he was stable, the battle could start becoming an actual battle. The first battle UI was functional, but it didn't feel like Final Fantasy yet. I had a command box and HP display working, then added a little yellow triangle for the selected command. It technically did its job, but it felt wrong immediately, so I replaced it with the classic Final Fantasy hand pointer. And that tiny hand does a remarkable amount of work. The moment it appears beside a command, your brain understands that it's a Final Fantasy game. I also added a rotating pyramid above the active character. Party turns use a yellow marker, enemies use a red one. It's not subtle, but that's the point. In a busy battle scene, a turn indicator shouldn't ask the player to solve a puzzle. The red marker could move between Seymour and the guards, and the target text updated with it. Then I added the CTB panel, which pulled the whole thing closer to Final Fantasy X specifically. The Guado guards are one model reused and mirrored. That sounds like a shortcut because it is one, but old games are built out of good shortcuts. People sometimes talk about palette swaps like they were just lazy, but on older hardware they were often practical design. Mortal Kombat did it with ninjas, RPGs did it constantly with enemy families. Reusing a silhouette saves memory, saves art time, and helps the player understand what kind of enemy they're looking at. The guards also led to a less visible problem. At one point, the game simply stopped booting. This was not a texture bug, it wasn't VRAM, it was normal PS1 RAM, which makes the issue a lot scarier. The newly imported healer model pushed the build close enough to the limit that the game didn't have enough headroom left. The big win came from a buffer called the Packet Arena. This is CPU side space used to build a frame. It's where the renderer prepares polygon packets, UI packets, draw commands, and the ordering table. The important catch is that the renderer keeps 2 of these frame buffers. So when I reduced packet length from 262,144 bytes to 196,608, that saved 64 kilobytes twice. That one change recovered 128 kilobytes of RAM, moving the project from about 57 kilobytes free to about 185 kilobytes free. On a modern machine that sounds like nothing, but on a PS1 that's the difference between the game being, well, a game and not even being able to boot. This whole section is very unglamorous, but it left me with a huge amount of respect for PS1 developers in the 90s. Once it booted reliably, the battle still had the other problem, it was incredibly slow. At one point it was running at around 7 FPS, which is more than a little rough. So I added an FPS counter and started treating performance as part of the design instead of something I could fix later. Some optimizations were obvious. If something was off-screen, it shouldn't be drawn. If an actor was not relevant to the current shot, it could stay quiet. The bigger win was catching projected battle geometry for the less dynamic actors. For characters, the game can project the mesh into screen space once and replay those catch triangles until the pose, animation frame, or camera changes. When it works, repeated 3D work becomes a much cheaper 2D replay step. I would not claim this is exactly how Final Fantasy VIII or Final Fantasy IX did it without reverse engineering proof, but it is a very believable class of technique for that era. With a fixed camera and such limited resources, you need to be extremely efficient with every little thing to make the game just work. After that pass, the fight climbed to around 19 or 20 FPS. Still not perfect, but after 7 FPS it felt like I was playing on a 240 FPS 4K monitor. For bigger attacks, I stopped drawing the whole arena. Instead, the game cuts to a black presentation space where only the acting character, the target, and the effect needs to exist. It also gives the PS1 breathing room. With the background gone and fewer actors visible, the scene can afford heavier effects and models. Seymour's spells came first, Fyra was the baseline, and then I built the other elemental spells around the same idea. Each one needed manual adjustment because target positions are not interchangeable. Watera was probably my favorite to fake. And there's no real fluid simulation here, the effect is simple geometry, translucent spray, sine wave motion, and a little bit of blue-white color to let the viewer finish the illusion. Then Tidus got his basic attack. Seymour flashes red when he's hit. I also made enemy HP appear only when the enemy is selected. From there, the fight filled out quickly. Tidus got a special attack, Lulu could cast Fyra and use her doll, Yuna could heal with Cure, then I added Shiva. Shiva is much heavier than a normal PS1 era model would be. In this build, she's around 2100 vertices, which makes sense because this one particular model isn't something I made. It's actually an import from the Final Fantasy III DS port. That would be a problem if the full battle was still being drawn, but the black presentation shot makes it work. And that's one of my favorite discoveries. You can afford one expensive thing if everything around it is cheap enough. Once the battle worked, I added death animations. There's a clip where everyone dies at the same time that I added as a test, and I think it just looks insanely dumb and funny. After Seymour goes down, I wanted the fight to escalate instead of just ending, so here's how that cutscene turned out.
Feel my pain. Come, Anima.
The whole cutscene is actually pretty simple. The portal is translucent triangle rings, the chain is simple boxy links, the impact is mostly camera shake and timing. And that's the part of demakes I find most interesting. You're not recreating the original shot literally, you're asking yourself what they might have done on completely different hardware. After that, I added Anima's attacks and eventually a death cutscene where it gets dragged back down. After the Macalania slice was working, I made a few extra scenes. The first was the Titus laughing scene, because every Final Fantasy X project is legally required to include it. That one is also an FMV just like before, except I didn't make it. Then I built Besaid. Macalania is controlled and staged. Besaid needed to feel more open, so I made a beach scene where Titus could run around and go into the water. The water is all suggestion. The ground has sine wave ripples, the surface uses translucent texture geometry, and Titus gets tinted blue when he goes under. None of it's real water, but it's a pretty decent fake for such weak hardware. I also tried giving Titus a separate face texture by patching his actual Final Fantasy face onto the model, and this was a mistake. He looked like some kind of horrible experiment gone wrong. Still, bad experiments are useful. They show where the limit is, and they make you appreciate how carefully older character artists had to balance texture detail against the shape of the model. Now, the only step was seeing if it would work on real hardware, so I'll let you look at some real gameplay on both a modern monitor and a CRT.
Feel my pain. Come, Anima.
Well, this was definitely the most interesting project I worked on so far, and it left me with an insane degree of respect for the Square developers for being able to push such amazing graphics and mechanics into hardware that's realistically hundreds of thousands of times weaker than what we have now. But it really helps us understand why they waited until the PS2 to do a massive concept like Final Fantasy X. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing as it really helps the channel. Leave a comment below suggesting what you want to see me do next, and I'll see you in the next one.